Hello everyone, welcome to our new series, Movies I Should Have Seen By Now, where I'll be going back in time and watching older movies that, well, I should have seen by now. As a lifelong movie fan and someone that studied film history and production, I have seen a lot of movies. But just like every other movie fan in the world, there are a ton of blind spots in my film knowledge. So in an effort to close those blind spots up a bit, I thought I'd finally sit down and watch a movie that's been on my radar for as long as I can remember, Steven Spielberg's 1977 classic, Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Now, I consider Steven Spielberg to be one of my 5 favorite directors of all time, and Raiders of the Lost Ark is my favorite movie of all time. But there are huge chunks of his filmography that I've just never seen, and Close Encounters is one of those movies, and one that I always wanted to see, but neither of my parents were big fans of it, so we never owned it, and I never really thought to rent it as a kid. And then, before I knew it, here I am, 34, and I've never seen what is considered to be one of Spielberg's early classics. So now that Born to Rant is a real channel and not just an idea in my brain, I thought it was the perfect excuse to sit down and finally cross Close Encounters off my list. And without getting too deep into my thoughts up front, I have to say, this is a pretty great movie, and I understand why it's considered a classic. But also, this movie is weird as fuck. It has one of the most unlikable protagonists across Spielberg's entire filmography, but somehow the entire movie manages to come together in spite of that. Okay, before I really get too deep into my thoughts, let's just go over what this video will and won't have in it. It will have a brief history of Close Encounters and its legacy as well as my review. It won't contain a full plot synopsis because if you're watching this, you've probably seen the movie anyway. With that being said, this is your official spoiler warning for a movie that came out almost 48 years ago. Okay, with that out of the way, let's talk about how this movie came to be and its legacy today. The inspiration for this movie actually stretches all the way back to Spielberg's childhood, when he watched a meteor shower with his dad and saw how transfixed his dad was by the sky. At 18, Spielberg actually made a feature-length film called Firelight, and it sounds like he reused a lot of the shot compositions from Firelight for Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Which is kind of cool to see that even at 18, Spielberg had a better grasp on shot composition than most people do a decade into their career. Anyway, Spielberg had actually agreed to develop a science fiction movie for Columbia prior to doing Jaws for Universal, so once Jaws hit big, it allowed him to fully focus on Close Encounters, and it gave him a lot of creative freedom as he made this movie. Now, the scripting and pre-production process for Close Encounters was pretty insane. The first screenwriter hired to tackle the story was Paul Schrader, whose script Spielberg once called one of the most embarrassing screenplays ever professionally turned into a major film studio or director. Apparently it had a lot of Schrader's touchstones about guilt and God, and if you've ever seen a Paul Schrader movie, I'm sure you know exactly what this script was like, slow and weird and bad. Not to say that Schrader only writes bad movies, but there's no middle ground with him. His movies are either great, like Taxi Driver or First Reformed, or they're fucking terrible, like The Canyons. Spielberg then passed it off to a few other screenwriters before eventually taking over the writing duties completely. He is actually the only credited screenwriter on the movie. Originally, the budget for this movie was set at $2.7 million before ballooning all the way up to $19.4 million. That's an absolutely insane increase. But hey, he was the guy that made Jaws. What are you gonna do? Say no when he comes around and tells you he needs more money to finish the movie you've already invested more than you can afford into? Actually, you know what? It's kind of a fucking miracle that this movie ever got made, because not only did Spielberg keep asking for money, but Columbia was in serious financial trouble at this point in their history, very nearly going bankrupt, and actually Close Encounters ended up being one of the movies to pull them out of their slump, because Close Encounters of the Third Kind made $288 million worldwide, and is now considered a classic science fiction movie and a classic in Spielberg's filmography, though it really does seem to have been overshadowed in the last decade or so by his other movies of the era. I feel like I'll hear people bring up Jaws, Raiders, or E.T. before they ever bring up this movie. And of course, Close Encounters released in 1977, the same year as Star Wars, and famously George Lucas and Steven Spielberg had an agreement that they share the profits of each other's movies with one another because they figured there was no way that both of their strange science fiction movies would be hits, and well, here we are with both of them being billionaires. But also in 2007, this movie was deemed culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant by the United States Library of Congress and was selected for preservation in the National Film Registry. So with this movie considered to be a classic, what did I think on my first watch through? I really liked this movie, but I'm also going to repeat what I said earlier. This movie's weird as fuck. And I'm not saying I dislike the movie at all, it's just that Roy Neary, our main character, is so incredibly unlikable, and this movie is a mashup of so many different types of movies. It's part personal family drama, part science fiction mystery, part adventure, and part horror movie all rolled into one, and it shouldn't work. Yet somehow it does, and not only does it work, it has the overwhelming Spielberg feeling of whimsy and optimism. But on the other side of that, I feel like people don't talk about how this movie is like 30% a horror movie. Like the science fiction and family drama stuff far outweigh the horror stuff, but you can't tell me that the abduction scene in this movie isn't a horrific scene. I mean, it literally looks like a scene from Poltergeist. I would also say that this movie is really the beginning of Spielberg's divorce canon, because at its heart, this movie is about Spielberg's parents getting divorced, and he's said as much in interviews, and I think now that we live in a post-Fabelmans world, it's kind of obvious that Spielberg viewed his dad as both the coward and the silent hero of the divorce. I don't really want to get too deep into it, so just go watch the Fabelmans if you haven't. I think it's really good, and not at all the kind of nostalgia bait I was expecting. So I guess let's talk about the Neary family. First of all, Dreyfuss is really great at playing this kind of detached, depressed, obsessive maniac. Gee, I wonder why. And Terry Gare is absolutely fantastic as Ronnie, and I think the two have really great chemistry together, both in the early scenes where they're still a loving family, and then in the middle of the movie where he's begging her for help. But what he's really begging for is for her to say it's okay for him to obsess over his UFO encounter, even though it's cost them absolutely everything. Like, the whole fight sequence is so well done, and I of course love the crybaby scene. Look, anyone who's ever grown up in a house with two parents who fight, you know these nights, and you know how much they fucking suck. And I think Spielberg nailed that feeling of being a helpless kid here. But it strikes me as so strange that after the next sequence, we just don't see the family again. Like, they are completely out of sight, out of mind from that point on. And then the ending has Roy just leaving the planet without saying goodbye to his wife or kids. It's just one of the most selfish things I've seen portrayed as a heroic act in any movie ever. Like I said earlier, this movie is also like 30% horror movie, and I really miss when Spielberg would dabble in horror like this. Even before seeing this movie, I knew most of the abduction scenes shot for shot, just because it's so iconic, and it was a trailer on like every Spielberg re-release in the early 90s. Like the shot of Barry playing the xylophone, the eerie, almost fire-colored light leaking through the keyhole, followed by the shot of Barry opening the door, are all fucking iconic. And speaking of the abduction scene, we haven't talked about Melinda Dillon yet, one of the all-time great movie moms. Across this movie, A Christmas Story, and Harry and the fucking Hendersons. Side note, how fucking weird is it that John Lithgow is going to be Dumbledore in the Harry Potter reboot? But anyway, Melinda Dillon is fantastic as Jillian. She's so great in the abduction scene. I love the way she's panicking and trying her best not to scare her kid. And you know what? I kind of think that the kid that played Barry was really solid. His name's Kerry Guffey, and this was the only movie he was ever in. He's only 4, and he plays being 4 very well. Not much else to say about it. She's also got really great chemistry with Dreyfuss's Roy, even though I think it's really weird that these two kiss at the end. Honestly, the thing that really surprised me the most about this movie is just how fully formed Spielberg feels. Like, yeah, I've seen Jaws a bunch, and I watched Duel recently as well, so I know that he had chops right away, but this felt like more than that. Like, this was our first glimpse into who Spielberg would become as a director. And what really surprised me was how much I found myself thinking about 2 other Spielberg movies, Jurassic Park and Raiders of the Lost Ark. Specifically, the opening with Truffaut finding the missing planes in the Sonora Desert. It just kind of reminded me of the opening of Jurassic Park. Just this kind of big operation that seems really secretive, but we're really not sure what's going on just yet. And then the end of the movie with Roy and Jillian finding the big base of scientists that are set up and ready to communicate with the aliens just reminded me of the ending of Raiders, where Indy and Marion are tied up as the Nazis get ready to test the Ark. Sadly, no Nazi faces are melted off in Close Encounters, but that would have been cool though. Again, these movies don't line up one-to-one or anything, but I do think it's interesting that Spielberg would go on to use a lot of the same kind of setup again in Raiders just a few years later, and then again in Jurassic Park. Again, not one-to-one. I also found myself thinking about Hitchcock movies as Roy and Jillian are scaling the mountain and trying to avoid the nerve gas being sprayed by the army. It really reminded me of North by Northwest specifically. I also really loved how silly the aliens looked in this movie. I like this really lanky looking motherfucker followed by these tiny guys. And finally, just a real quick shout out to the brilliant Francois Truffaut as Claude Lacombe, a French scientist working with the US military. I don't really have too much to say about his character. I just think it's neat that Spielberg cast him in the movie. Anyway, my main problem with this movie is the ending, and honestly the character of Roy Neary overall. I think he's one of the most selfish characters across any of Spielberg's movies, and I know in the decades since this movie came out, Spielberg has even gone on record and said that he would absolutely do a different ending were he to make Close Encounters again today. Like, this guy has a big blowout with his wife and kids leave him, he has one follow-up phone call with her that goes very poorly, and he just gives up on his family because he feels so compelled to go on this adventure. And then at the end of the movie, he makes out with another lady and then just leaves the planet. He leaves his wife and kids behind, doesn't even call to say goodbye, just pieces out without so much as a phone call. And again, I'm not complaining because I think the movie works in spite of this giant character flaw. But overall, I really did enjoy Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And it was really nice to scratch one of Spielberg's early classics that I'd never seen off of my to-watch list. And I'm kind of glad I waited, because it's nice to get to watch little surprises like this as an adult, and I also know there's no fucking way I would have enjoyed this movie as a kid. It's too long and slow and boring, although the first hour and last 20 minutes are pretty fucking great. And maybe that would have been enough to win me over as a kid. It's tough to say. I mean, I don't feel like I really appreciated the original Star Wars as a movie until I became an adult, because as a kid, it felt a little slow. I mean, certainly slower than the other movies in the franchise. But ultimately, I give Close Encounters of the Third Kind a 4 out of 5. It's a really interesting chapter in Spielberg's early filmography. It's really the first time that divorce was a big theme for him, but it's also got that horror influence that early Spielberg movies all had. And at the end of the day, it just feels like the kind of movie we'd all love to see him make again. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments if I went too hard on this movie. Where does it rank for you in the Spielberg filmography? I'm thinking of doing Ghost in the Shell or one of the many Miyazaki movies I haven't seen next in the series. Would you guys be into that? I've been Brandon from Born to Rant, and if you made it this far into the video, thank you for watching. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. We release new videos every Thursday morning at 7 a.m. Pacific time. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.